You back to the last and final installment of the study series, The Basics. This is part 12. We'll be wrapping up this series of studies with this last study. And I think that the theme for this particular study is probably very appropriate for the last study here. When I begin putting together this series of studies, for those who have been following along and started with the very first part, I didn't really have any idea how far that would go. I didn't really have any idea what would be all of the themes to the end. In the slide where I have images and go through the second slide and go through all the different study topics that we've taken in this series of studies, of course, the layout has been the same from the very beginning. And it's just kind of interesting how it kind of just wraps it up with this one being the last image in that series of images. And there's just a lot of things in this study as I look back across having done it all that I marvel at. I marvel at because, again, I didn't have any set plan to do 12 studies or to do a specific amount. It just basically, as I went along, God gave me the parts, and I jotted down notes for the parts, and as it proceeded, he gave me more parts until finally he gave me the last piece for the series. And it always amazes me, and it is a marvel to me how God does that. And I find it really unique over the last year and a half, almost 2 years now, the series of studies that God has given me. And of course, if you put them all in a line and follow through them, I find it very unique, the pattern and what the story is that God, I think, is trying to tell us as a people. And so, that's just, I'm going to put together a small study in the near future, kind of lining out all those studies that God has given me in the last couple of years, and just so you can have a better idea of what I'm seeing. Sorry, from my perspective as the guy doing the studies. And so again, none of this was planned. Every one of these studies that I've done over the last couple of years, God gave me at the moment, and one kind of built out another. And of course, after this, the basics, there are already a couple other studies I'm working on, and they build off of this. And so to me, that's pretty important. Again, we start out with this image of the ruins there in Greece, and a quote from one of the Greek scholars of that period of time, Marcus Aurelius, famous in his own right in many ways, says, don't await perfection, but be satisfied with even the smallest step forward and regard the outcome as a small thing. I just think that that is a very appropriate statement for this study in particular. Too often I find in my own life and in the lives of other people when I'm talking with them, we like to wait, so to speak, till we have all the parts to something that we want to do. And unless we have all the parts, we don't want to start. An example of that is, of course, baptism itself. And this was true in my own life. When I was young, we were at a reunion, a special reunion, and there was a friend being baptized. And it was the first time in my life I'd ever had an experience like this. But when my friend was down there with the minister being baptized, of course, there was a voice in my own heart, in my own head, that told me, you should be down there asking for baptism. At that time in my life, I was not baptized. I was about 16 years old. When the baptism was taking place, I was almost animated enough to go ahead and ask. I know if I had asked at that very moment, the minister would have happily taken me as a second candidate down into the waters of baptism. I believe he would have. But as I watched the baptism take place, something in my own heart said, wait a minute, you've got all these problems in your life. Why don't you first go home after all this reunion is done, solve all of your own issues, and when you've cleaned up your life, then you'll be ready to ask for baptism. And it seemed logical to me. And that's kind of what I'm talking about. Too often we try to find that perfection before we begin. Well, needless to say, I went home and strove for 2 years to try to get out of my life the things that I thought and felt were wrong according to the scripture, with absolutely no success whatsoever. I would take things and I would remove them from my life only to then grasp them and put them back in. And too often I find people are just like that. As I'm operating, I find people who are living together without marriage, and their list of requirements to get married in their own heart, not according to God or according to the law, but in their own heart, are so great that they can't ever achieve it. And too often, I think that's what we're looking at. We're looking at having this perfect picture. I think about the kingdom of God itself as a place that we all want to get to. It's almost as if we don't want to start helping build it until we can start 100%. And that's just not really the way life is. So many of the greatest, most successful businessmen in this world started out in small steps. They didn't just start out with a turnkey business that was 100% at get-go. And that's something I think is very important to remember. And of course, that is everything about this study. Because if we're going to start in small steps, we have to have a goal. We have to have a purpose. We have to have a direction that we're willing to go till the end of our life. And that's what Marcus Aurelius, I feel, is saying here. Don't wait for perfection. Don't wait until you have all your ducks in a row. Don't wait until you find that everything is perfect according to your thoughts. But rather, every day, move a small step forward. And regard it as nothing. Just keep going and just keep going. And don't pat yourself on the back. Don't praise yourself for the small things, so to speak. Just keep going with a goal in mind. And I think you will find it'll happen before you know it. And that is the grace of God. That is also the wonderful blessing of God in our life. And so that's kind of the theme of this study. As we continue, we'll see that. But in John 14:6, it tells us, like we've read this verse throughout all this study, and I hope you have it memorized in your head and printed there, because I feel like inside of this verse, every time I read it, something else opens up to my vision. Something else opens up to my mind. And I think it's so important to our overall well-being spiritually. But it says, Jesus said unto him, I am the way. And that in itself is a statement that's enormous to me. It's not just speaking of a path. It's not just speaking of an example. It's speaking of so many other aspects that come with it, including, of course, sacrament. And so if Jesus is the way, when we partake of the emblems of sacrament, we're partaking of the way. But there's more to that, because Jesus is the truth. And so as we uphold and participate in the truth, as we search for truth, as we embrace truth and reject false narratives, lies, and the false things of this world, then of course we are searching for the way. And that is, we live in a day today when it's so vitally important to be able to see the false narratives. And too often, Christians, us, me, we are too embroiled in false narratives. We think we're supporting the truth. We think that this is the way, and it's not. We're failing miserably because we haven't paid attention to what the real truth is. And so we've got to search out the absolute truth. I think about so many countries. Of course, as I'm recording this, we're still in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic. And I think about how many countries, in the world, we have this political spectrum between conservative, liberal, and there's a lot of other words, a lot of other names that we apply to whatever side of the political spectrum a person might favor. But one of the things that we always are talking about is the distinctions. And of course, there's a lot of conservatives who will speak passionately against socialism, communism, or whatever other isms might be out there. But then as you flip the page in the middle of a pandemic, they are more than happy to argue for handouts from the government. And I don't want to make this political, but this is part of the absolute necessity of understanding that Christ is the truth. Because we can't have it both ways. We can't argue against something and then argue for it. That's not truth. And so as true believers, we've got to discover what is truth. If socialism is truth, if socialism is not truth, we've got to discover the absoluteness of that and not ride the fence and not play games. Okay? Because if Jesus is the truth, as we're discovering that truth and embracing that truth, we're finding the way. And that's important. Vitally important today, because the world is abhorring the truth. And in its abhorrence of the truth, of course, inevitably it's abhorring Jesus Christ. But as we search for truth, as we embrace truth in every aspect of our life, as an engineer in my background, of course, building anything requires absolute facts. Numbers are absolute facts. Addition, subtraction, algebra, calculus, you name it. It's all the art of dealing with facts. And it's through those facts that we can create. We can create a building, we can create an engine, we can create a vehicle, we can create whatever we want to create, a cell phone. Why? Because we have facts to work from. And so, even in the acceptance of those facts, I am embracing a part of Jesus Christ. And that's important to remember. We never want to give up the facts. When we talk about how many different genders there are, of course, the world is talking about anything from 6 to 126, and I'm sure there's probably a whole lot more after that once they start really getting into it. But the reality of it is, scientifically, there's 2. As we embrace the fact that there's only 2 genders, we're embracing truth. If I ride the fence and I say, well, but what about? Okay, then I'm not embracing truth. I'm actually setting truth to the side and I'm questioning whether or not that's really what I want. Oftentimes when we're riding the fence because people around us may look bad upon us, may frown upon us. The world may frown upon us. And of course, as Christians, we've got to work. We've got our jobs out in the world, maybe, in the business world or wherever we are. We've got our jobs. We're going there every day. We've got to provide for our family. We've got to provide for our kids. We show up, the boss says, well, there's 6 genders and you have to accept that. And I don't want to lose my job. So I ride the fence. We can't ride the fence as Christians. As long as we keep riding the fence, we are rejecting the way and the truth. There's no 2 ways about it. And so we've got to make a choice. Is the truth what's important to us? Is Jesus Christ what's important to us? Or is the acceptance of the world what's important to us? And of course, people will come to me and they'll say, but what about my kids? What about my family? If I lose my job, I can't provide for them. And I would counter, if you really believe that by standing for Jesus Christ and the truth, you're going to lose your job and your family's going to starve to death, then I have to counter with the fact that you don't actually believe in Jesus Christ. You don't. And I don't mean that in a harsh way or in a hard way, but just accept you do not believe in Jesus Christ. Because Jesus Christ, we know, loves his children more than we can ever imagine. And to believe for 1 second that he's going to stand on the sidelines and watch you starve to death because you stood for truth is to say that you don't believe in him. And that brings in the 3rd part of this verse. Jesus Christ is life. And that's why, again, this is so important, because when we're looking for the way, when we're following the way, when we're embracing the truth, when we're standing for the truth, we find we have life. And that's amazing. And until you've done it, sometimes it's hard to see it. I know that when we are on the sidelines, standing on the fence, sometimes we haven't truly embraced everything I've been speaking about here. Sometimes it's easy to say, well, I can't see it. I haven't ever experienced it, and that's okay. To not have experienced it is okay. And I'm not telling you that if you're on the fence, you're going to hell right now. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is, if you embrace the way, if you take the truth and stand for it, you will discover you will have life. And it is life abundantly. And that is an awesome place to get to. But don't stand on false narratives. Don't stand on false ways. Stand on the way, Jesus Christ. Stand on the truth. I know in my particular neck of the woods where we live and where I operate as a missionary, it's very common to hear people say, well, all churches are basically good. No, that's not true. Because this does not say there are many truths. It says there is the truth. And that's important. Jesus is the truth. There's no other way about it. And as long as we keep trying to believe that there are many truths, then we're not really embracing the truth yet. And we've got to get off the fence. We've got to understand there's one truth. That's Jesus Christ. He is the way, and in him we encounter life. And no man will get to the Father except by this. When it says by me, it's speaking of Jesus Christ himself, and he is the life. So if we don't have this life, we're not getting to the Father. If we don't have this truth, if we don't embrace this truth, we're not getting to the Father. I don't care how warm and fuzzy you feel, you won't get there. If you're not embracing this way, the way of Jesus Christ, you will not get to the Father. This is the requirement. To get to the Father, you've got to go through Jesus Christ, the way, the truth, the life. And when we do this and we embrace these three things, of course, John 8:32 tells us, and ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. And it is amazing when we find this freedom. We operate in a different level entirely from the rest of the world. And to me, that is so amazing when we encounter this freedom. And for those of you who have never found this freedom, I would recommend you to do all you can. Put these verses in your mind and in your heart. Meditate on them. Think about them. Ask God in your prayers, your daily prayers. If you need to, dedicate some time to fasting. Ask God with all your heart, how can I better put these two verses in my life? How can I better act on them? How can I better live them out in my life? And of course, when we do that, of course, from the very beginning on this slide, I've had the quote down in the corner from Euclid that we started out with. The laws of nature are but the mathematical thoughts of God. And then like I said, when we encounter what's in these two verses, we find that this phrase is true. Everything around us, it's just the thoughts of God. It's there, and we can see it, and we discover it, and the world becomes a new place. And all of a sudden, all the sadness and all the misery that we may be living for whatever reasons in our life begins to dissolve away. And life is good. Life is good. And that's what, of course, God wants us to discover. And so, like I said, we've got our picture here pretty well covered. We started out with some physical aspects. Again, I didn't cover everything absolutely, but I just wanted to give us these ideas for beginning this journey. We covered the earth and the universe, the fingerprint of God, the body, the health, physical aspects of the world we live in. And then we went on to spiritual aspects, true mercy, true love, true faith, being authentic, being peacemakers. And that's really hard today because all of us want to stand up and defend liberty. And we don't necessarily want to be peacemakers right now. And of course, the more wild whatever the other side is to us, doesn't matter where you are, but wherever the other side is, the more wild they become, the less we want to be peacemakers. The more we want to destroy them, get rid of them, the more we want to take up arms or whatever it is and defend ourselves. But God calls us to be peacemakers. And in today's day, in the coming days before Jesus Christ's return, that's the hardest time. And I would recommend you to read the period of time in the Book of Mormon, Helaman, 3rd Nephi, before Christ's first coming, because you'll see that our day and age is no different than their day and age. In fact, so much of it's a repeat, and that's worth reading and studying about. And so God calls us to be peacemakers. God calls us to know the spirits, to be able to discern between those spirits that are causing us to create enemies, maintain enemies, do evil, those spirits that cause us to want to lie, cheat, steal, those spirits that cause us to want to do all that is wrong and deplorable by God. And know the difference. God wants us to be long-suffering. In this dark day, we will suffer. We will suffer as Christians. We will suffer as believers. More than this, even more than the idea of suffering as Christians and as children of God, we will suffer if we defend the truth. And you will find that even atheists today who are standing on truths, for instance, that there's only two genders, they are being canceled. They are suffering. They're suffering because they're willing to stand in a truth. And so that brings us to the very last piece of this. Too often, we like our prestige and our power. Too often, we like to have renown. And so, like we see in the world today, a lot of people, when they stand on the truth, of course, they get canceled by one group or another. And when they are canceled, of course, they quickly come back and they're apologizing and they're asking for forgiveness because they don't want to lose their place in society. But for those of us who are true Christians, we have to have perseverance. We have to endure to the end. It's not just long suffering, it's long suffering, perseverance to the end of our life. And this is vitally important. So let's continue on with our study, Hebrews 6:15. And so after he had patiently endured, he obtained the promise. And this is the crux of it. We have to patiently endure, and it's not going to be easy. We have to patiently endure everything that's happening around us, all the things that we disagree with, all the things that we hate. We have to patiently endure until Christ makes things right. Some things we can't change as believers. We can stand on the truth, we can defend the truth, but we have to patiently endure. We are in a dark hour for a reason. It is because darkness has become the majority. When darkness becomes the majority, you can't fight it with sticks and stones. You have to fight it on the spiritual level. And so we have to patiently endure their beatings, whatever they may be, and keep professing the truth and patiently endure. Mormon 4, the latter part of the verse, 95b, it says, and if ye do this and endure to the end, you will in no wise be cast out. Once we've encountered life, true life in Jesus Christ, based on that very first verse in John that we read, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Once we've encountered that life, this physical body means nothing. If they put me in a jail cell and starve me to death, it means nothing. I know that's hard to believe, and it's hard to think, and it's hard to feel because we're human. We feel hunger, we feel pain. But the reality of it is, once we've found true life, the pains and suffering of this physical body don't matter to us as much because we know that we can endure. We have something greater inside of us. And so we can become masters of our own self. Hebrews 4:11. Let us labor, therefore, to enter into that rest, not this rest, that rest. Lest any man fall after the same example of unbelief. And so we are laboring, means we're working with difficulty, which is why we have to endure, which is why we have to have patience. One does not build an entire universe in a day, so to speak. One does not build a perfect life in a day. It may take a lifetime, which is why we have that, and that's why it's called a lifetime. And so we labor diligently to build this life in the image of God. We wait patiently. We wait with endurance. We strive never leaving off the things that we know are absolutely true and right. We do not let the devil shut us down. We continue forward through fear. In a dark day, in a dark hour, there will be lots of fear. And, for those of you that have not read it, I fully recommend you to read The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. Think about what happened to that era. Christians living in a hard time, the government telling them, shut down, shut your doors, quit preaching the gospel. But they couldn't. But that meant they went to the lions. That meant they went to the Colosseum. That meant that they died horrible spectacles in front of the people, yet they held firm. They would not set aside the gospel. We cannot set aside the gospel for anything. If we let our fear dominate us, we have lost. We don't really believe in God. We cannot let our fears of anything dominate us. We have to hold fast. This is what it's talking about. Laboring in that dark hour, in that difficulty, enduring against all odds. As the image here shows, you see people running in competition. And I think about that because in order for us to achieve an Olympic gold medal, it's not just about entering. It's not just about signing up. It's not just about showing up. It's about practicing every stinking day of our life. Every day, making that effort until we become Olympic material. And that's what we have to do. We have to make that effort every single day. And that's the labor of love that we have, because we want salvation and we encounter life, and it is life abundantly. Oftentimes, as you're building an empire, thinking about worldly terms, there's people in this world, Bill Gates, Elon Musk, you name it, whoever it is, they started out small. They built. Today we look at them as billionaires or even more so. And we think about, wow, wouldn't it be wonderful to have their life? They didn't always have that life. And so we need to compare this. What they're living physically is their heaven. This is what they strived for. We need to make that same effort for our heaven, which is not an earthly heaven per se. And so when we make that effort just like they did, then we can hope to achieve what they achieved on a different plane. But yes, we have to make the same effort. If you're not willing to put in that effort, then you're not going to achieve it. It's just where it's at. You'll never get an Olympic gold medal unless you put the effort to get the Olympic gold medal. Some people tell me, well, I just can't do it. Well, that's your choice. God tells us that we're free to choose. We're free to choose the path of darkness and captivity and the devil, or we're free to choose the path of life and light. There is no other path. And unless you're going to join another religion that believes in multiple glories, the only way to get there is to become Olympic grade material spiritually. And so we've got to make that effort. And if you don't want to make that effort, then you're in the wrong business. That's the effort we have to make. Patiently enduring. Let's continue. Hebrews 11, 8 through 10. We're actually going to touch on the lives of, one particular person here, Abraham, as you'll see by the image here and also the beginning of the text. But we're going to touch on a couple other people too in this text. One of the reasons I wanted to touch specifically on Abraham is because so often when we use Jesus Christ as an example, obviously he is the perfect example and the best example. But too often when we use him as an example, of course, he is a perfect example. And we see that. And we look at him and we say, well, he was the Son of God. I can't do that. And so by using Abraham or any of the forefathers who were excellent examples, as examples, we're no longer seeing a perfect example. We're seeing someone like you and I. And that's important because we see their strengths and we see their weaknesses. We see the good things they did. We see their errors. And that can give us an idea of what God's expecting for us. God knows we're not perfect. God knows we're going to make mistakes. That's okay. What God wants is that perseverance, that we will continue till the end of our life. And so as we look at Abraham here, there's a couple of key things I want to bring out. I want to bring out just briefly a little bit about who Abraham was and how he was human just like us. But I also want to bring out that God gave him promises as God gave us promises. And he was willing to hold the course to receive those promises. So, by faith, Abraham, when he was called to go out into a place which he should after receive as an inheritance, he obeyed, and he went out, not knowing whither he went. By faith he sojourned in a land of promise as in a strange country, dwelling in tabernacles with Isaac and Jacob, and the heirs with him of the same promise. For he looked for a city which hath foundations, whose builder and maker is God. And so this is the overview of Hebrews. Now Hebrews is a long time after Genesis and Abraham. But here we have this witness of Abraham. Number one, he was called out of his place. You know, oftentimes we're born somewheres and our family's there, our uncles, our aunts, our grandparents, cousins, nieces, whatever. We've got family everywhere. And oftentimes we have a hard time leaving that area. Here we have Abraham being called out. And of course, we could be reading about Lehi. Lehi was also called out to go to a place which he would receive for an inheritance. Howbeit, he didn't know where he was going. In either case, Abraham or Lehi, they didn't know where they were going, but they left in faith. They had understanding, they believed in God, and they acted on that belief through faith, leaving behind what was their earthly promise and inheritance to find a new promise and inheritance. They sojourned, as Abraham did, in a land of promise. God, when he brought him, and we will see pieces of this, showed him the promised land, Israel, the place. It says, this is yours. But we're going to see shortly, Abraham never got it. He sojourned as a stranger. Imagine you, your grandparents, your great-grandparents, your parents, whoever, were wealthy beyond compare. And there is an inheritance set aside for you. But you don't get it while you're living. You don't get it till you're dead. This is the promise that Abraham received. Now, I don't know if he understood the depth of his promise. I don't know if he looked at the land and said, this is it. I don't think so. I think Abraham was a very spiritual man, and I think he understood far more than we can imagine. But he had the perseverance to wait. And it says in verse 10, he looked for a city. He looked for something already built by people before him, but whose builder was not man. It was not mankind. He was looking for a city built by divine spiritual hands. And that's the city we look for. That's the city I look for. Not a city that we build. We build our lives, and our persons become part of the city. But the city is built by God. We become a part of it. Abraham was a part of it. He was a pillar in that divine city. Let's continue. Genesis 11, 31 and 32. And Terah took Abraham his son, and Lot, the son of Haran, his son's son, and Sarai, his daughter-in-law, and his son Abram's wife, and they went forth with them from Ur of the Chaldees to go to the land of Canaan. And they came to Haran and dwelt there. And the days of Terah were 205 years, and Terah died in Haran. And so we can see in the map here, bottom right, we find Babylon. Just a little bit more southeast of Babylon, we find a small spot called Ur of the Chaldees. Abraham was a Chaldee. There were no such thing as Israelites. Israelites is a term that God made later to define his people. There are no genetic Israelites. They don't exist. The genetic Israelites are genetic Chaldeans. That's where they come from. They're genetics. And that's important to think about, because as we are Christians, we are not genetic Christians. Our DNA did not change just as their DNA did not change. But we are called out to be Christ's people. And so we become a people. We become the spiritual Israel. And that's important to remember because they were a physical Israel. Today we are a spiritual Israel. But again, there's no genetics changing. There is a mental change. When Abraham decided to leave Ur of the Chaldees, he left behind other religions and he chose to follow the true God, the way, the truth, the life. And he encountered life. And so he went forth. And you can see there's two little lines coming from Ur of the Chaldees. One of them's a red dotted line, one of them's a black dotted line. And the reality is they could have went either way in their journey. But they went up to, if you follow either one of those two dotted lines, they come up to a town called Haran. Right about in the center of the map on the northern part of it. Probably right in the southern part of Turkey today, roughly speaking. I'm not quite sure, but it looks like it's right about into Turkey. Haran might be a little bit south of Turkey, might actually be in Syria, or I think chances are, I can't tell on this map particularly, but it's either in what we would call Turkey today, the southern tip of it, or in the northern tip of Syria. But this is where they get to. When they get here, Terah dies. Abram's father passes away at 205 years. Now, Terah, why did he leave? He left because of a promise. He didn't just go for kicks. He left because of a promise that is now being transferred to his son Abraham. That's important to remember. So we can see after that dotted line, a solid red line. This is their continued path. So as they go, 205 years is how old Terah is when he dies. We have Abraham, we have Abram, we have Sarai, we have Lot, and they're leaving their land of inheritance to go for another land. Genesis 12, 1 through 4. And the Lord said unto Abraham, Get thee out of thy country, and from thy kindred, and from thy father's house, unto a land I will show thee. And of course, this has two parallel paths. Obviously, he's leaving the physical land of his inheritance. But more than that, as a Chaldean, he is now separating himself from their traditions, from their ways, from their beliefs. And he's becoming a new creature. He's separating himself from that path of the old country and beginning a new path, a new country in Jesus Christ himself. And this is what God tells him, a land I will shew thee. And so he's listening to the Spirit, he's listening to God, and he's becoming a new creature. Verse 2, And I will make of thee a great nation, and I will bless thee and make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing. Does that not perfectly fit with who Jesus Christ is? He's the way. This is what it's telling us in this verse. Jesus Christ has never changed. He's the way. It's the truth. We know that because, of course, we see it happen in Abraham's life. We have that history written, and he is life. And we will see that also because he was life for Abraham. And that's what this is reiterating in different words. Verse 3, And I will bless them that bless thee, and curse them that curse thee. And in thee shall all families of the earth be blessed. So Abraham departed. He believed the truth. He followed the way, as the Lord has spoken unto him. And Lot went with him. And Abraham was 75 years old when he departed out of Haran. And so 75 years, that's, in today's terms, that's pretty old. To make a trip like he's making, their trip was right around 950,000 miles, roughly speaking. That's a long way to go as a man 75 years old. Of course, as we're going to see, he hit quite a bit older. So, we might be able to infer that his 75 was maybe our 40 or 50 of today. But still, that's pretty old to be making this kind of a change. He's leaving his lands, his peoples, and going on for something new. Verses 6 and 7 in Genesis 12, And Abraham passed through the place of Shittim unto the plain of Moreh. And the Canaanite was then in the land. And the Lord appeared unto Abraham and said, Unto thy seed will I give this land. And there builded he an altar unto the Lord who appeared to him. So they continued the solid red line going south, mostly south, a little bit west. They pass through Damascus and they get to Shechem. And just below that, above the Hebron plain, right around in that area, Abraham puts up an altar to God because he understands that now he's left behind all the old religions of his people, the Chaldeans, and he has now taken upon him the religion of the one true God, the truth, the way, the life. And this is what he's accepting. And so here he is in an unknown land among strangers. He doesn't know anyone here, but he's setting up a new life. If he can do it, we can do it. And that's all we have to remember. God never gives us anything to do that we can't accomplish. Genesis 12:11 through 20, and it came to pass when he was come near to enter into Egypt, that he said to Sarai, his wife, Behold, now I know that thou art a fair woman to look upon. And I think this is a wonderful statement coming from Abraham. He's 75 years old. His wife is up there. I think she's probably about, I don't remember what the difference is between their life. It might have been 10 years. I think we'll see it later on. But so she's right around 65 to 70 years in that ballpark. And he's looking at his wife and saying, you're still stunning. You still are gorgeous. And I'm a little bit worried as we go into this next place because the guys there are likely to look at you as a beautiful person also. And here we see Abraham, the man. Verse 12. Therefore it shall come to pass when the Egyptians shall see thee, that they shall say, This is his wife, and they will kill me, but they will save thee alive. Say, I pray thee, thou art my sister, and it may be well with me, for thy sake. And my soul shall live because of thee. And it came to pass that when Abraham was come into Egypt, the Egyptians beheld the woman, that she was very fair. The princes of the Pharaoh saw her and commended her before the Pharaoh. And the woman was taken into the Pharaoh's house. And so, remarkable. Here is Sarah, 65, 70 years old, and she is obviously very good looking. She has aged very well. They come into Egypt, and what does Abraham do? He says, tell a half-truth, tell a half-lie. I don't know, is a half-truth a full lie or a half-lie? That's something we're thinking about. He says, tell them that you're my sister. That was true. Sarah was his sister, but she was also his wife. And it was a dangerous game that Abraham was playing because he was being dishonest with the Egyptians. And that dishonesty almost cost them everything because God was with Abraham because he was a good man. But the point of reading this is to see that Abraham was just that. He was a human, like you and I. He made his mistakes. And to me, this is a huge mistake, lying to a foreign government about who your wife is, that they might accidentally take her and make them part of the harem of the Pharaoh. Probably not the wisest move he could have made. I understand his thoughts behind it, but still, I have a hard time thinking I would have done it. But yet we live in an age, much like Abraham, there are fears around us. There are fears about the COVID pandemic, masks, no masks, vaccines, no vaccines, you name it. There are fears around us. And we, like Abraham, are falling prey to fears. And we need to keep our strength in God. I suspect if Abraham had rested in God, he would not have generated the problems he generated. We need to rest in God. We need not to have the fears that the world fears. We need to rest in God and follow what he tells us, sticking to the absolute truth. That's very important. Let's continue. We're in verses 16 through 20. And he entreated Abraham well for her sake. And he had sheep and oxen and asses and manservants and maidservants and she-asses and camels. So Abraham, So Abraham was greatly, richly blessed because he was willing to bend his morals just a little bit. And oftentimes when we are operating in the world, we are blessed when we bend our morals, blessed by the world. But the problem is the world can't save us. It can help us survive for a day or two or three, but the world cannot save our soul. It just can't. We think that by allowing the world to preserve our life, it will give us a chance to save our soul. But what we do for habits ends up becoming part of us, and those habits become deadly. And that's where Abraham is, and that's where we end up being. We end up forming deadly habits, hoping that down the line, I'll be able to rectify. It doesn't work that way. We need to form our good habits from the get-go. Abraham should have remained firm in his resting on God. Verse 17, and the Lord plagued Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarai, Abram's wife. And so here comes the problems. Now, I don't really know where Pharaoh was. We don't really have a keen understanding. I mean, obviously the Egyptians have always been idolatrous people as far as we know. But in this perspective, here is this new lady in the Pharaoh's household being prepared to become one of his wives, and all of a sudden there are problems all over the place. All of a sudden there's plagues in the house. How the Pharaoh figured out that it was because of Sarai, how the Pharaoh figured out that it was because of Abraham, I'm not entirely sure. Maybe Sarah herself told the Pharaoh all of this. I couldn't tell you there. Or maybe God came to him in a dream or a vision and told him. I can't tell you there either. But what we know is there were plagues all of a sudden on Pharaoh's house, and Pharaoh figured it out. Verse 18, and Pharaoh called Abram and said, what is this that thou hast done unto me? Why didst thou not tell me she was thy wife? And so Pharaoh's mad. He's not happy to have stolen Abraham's wife. He's actually mad because Abraham didn't say, this is my wife. Verse 19, why saidst thou, she is my sister, so I might have taken her to me to wife? Now therefore, behold thy wife, take her and go away. Get out of town. And Pharaoh commanded his men concerning him, and they sent him away, and his wife and all that he had. And so he had to leave. There was no blessing for Pharaoh because of Abraham's presence. There should have been. Abraham should have been a blessing to the Egyptians. He couldn't be because he bent his morals. When we bend our morals, we are no longer a blessing to those around us. We fail in being a light, just as Abraham failed to be a light to the Pharaoh. Could the Pharaoh have been converted to Christianity, to the one true God? We'll never know, because Abraham's mistakes left a scar. And oftentimes our mistakes do too, and we have to live with that. That's who we are as humans, just as he was human. But that does not mean we should give it all up. We need to preserve, we need to stay the course. We make mistakes. Any athlete who is preparing for Olympics or any other famous competition, they make errors along the way also. They need to stay the course. And in staying the course, they achieve their goals. Let's continue. Genesis 17, we're going to read verse 1 and 2, and then 15 through 19. And when Abraham was 99 years old, so now we've advanced from 75, he's now 99 years old, the Lord appeared to Abraham and said unto him, I am the Almighty God. Walk before me, and be thou perfect. And I will make my covenant between me and thee, and will multiply thee exceedingly. So God is offering to bless Abraham. He's been following God for some 20 years. At least we know that he was about 75 when he came into the land, probably left the land of Ur of the Chaldees, maybe, he was 75 when he reached Shechem. It might have been a 10-year journey, who knows? So it might have been about 65 when he left. Don't really know according to what we've read here. But what we know now is he's about 90-some years old. And God's promising him. Abraham has no direct descendants. But God is promising him, you will be a great people, a great nation. And Abraham's 99 years old. Verse 15, and God said to Abraham, as for Sarai, thy wife, thou shalt not call her name Sarai, but Sarah shall be her name. And I will bless her and give thee a son also of her. Yea, I will bless her, and she shall be a mother of nations. King of people shall be of her. Then Abraham fell on his face and laughed, and said in his heart, Shall a child be born to him that is 100 years old? And shall Sarah that is 90 years old bear? And Abraham said unto God, Oh, that Ishmael might live before thee. And God said, Sarah, thy wife shall bear thee a son indeed, and thou shalt call his name Isaac, and I will establish my covenant with him for an everlasting covenant, and with his seed after him. And so Ishmael's already on the scene, of course, in our story at this point, and that's a separate story altogether. But at 99 years old, almost 100, Abraham rounds it up to 100. His wife is 90 years old. So again, there's this 10-year difference between them. God's telling him, you're going to have a son from your wife, Sarah. And it's extraordinary to him. Now, he's been spending all these years following God. He's been blessed. He's multiplied. We know from the story between him and Lot, they were so blessed that they couldn't live together anymore because Lot's animals, servants, and whatnot were so many that they were constantly stumbling over all of Abraham's servants and animals. And so they had to, they had to put some distance between themselves. And so they did. Abraham took one area, Lot took another area, and they continued to be blessed, exceedingly blessed. But God walks in and says, you are going to have direct descendant, and it's through your direct descendant that my blessings will come. And so we had Terah, Abraham's father. Now we have Abraham, and now there's going to be another one after Abraham, Isaac. This is the promise. In other words, Terah didn't receive the promise. Abraham won't receive the promise. It's going on now to Isaac. Let's continue. Chapter 18, verse 17 through 19. And the Lord said, Shall I hide from Abraham that thing which I shall do? Seeing that Abraham shall surely become a great and mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth shall be blessed in him. For I know him, that he will command his children and his household after him, and they shall keep the way of the Lord, to do justice and judgment, that the Lord may bring upon Abraham that which he hath spoken. And of course, we remember the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. God comes with some angels and is talking with Abraham, and he's going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. He's going to burn them with fire. And so what I find interesting about this passage is Abraham's ability to negotiate with God. Verses 23 and 24. And Abraham drew near and said, Wilt thou also destroy the righteous with the wicked? Peradventure there be 50 righteous within the city. Wilt thou also destroy and not spare the place for the 50 righteous that are therein? And so Abraham is negotiating with God. What made Abraham think he could bargain with God? And of course, it's his life, his righteousness. Because when you're in the way, when you are holding and upholding the truth, when you have life, you know God exists. He's part of everything you do. And yes, God will talk with you. And yes, when you are as righteous as Abraham, who was a man, he was a human just like you and I. He had his mistakes and his faults, but he could talk with God. And he could negotiate. And we know he negotiated down, I think it's, I don't remember, 5 or 10 people. If there were 5 or 10 righteous, God would preserve the city. But the reality is we know that there wasn't even that many. Who got out? Lot got out, his 2 daughters, and his wife almost got out. And so there really wasn't that many righteous in there. And of course, the scripture also leads us to believe that Lot and his daughters were not the most righteous of people. But they got out because of Abraham. And so this is important to think about. We may have mistakes, but if we are enduring to the end, we have God's ear. We can talk to him for the world. Abraham is negotiating for Sodom and Gomorrah, obviously for the righteous that are in there, no doubt, but he's still negotiating for them. Because if there were 10 righteous and God preserves the city, the wicked are as much preserved as the righteous. And that's important to think about. I think about the COVID pandemic that we are in right now. We have the ability, if we are like Abraham, to negotiate with God for the wicked. in a sense, because we negotiate for the righteous. And that's our goal, to negotiate for the righteous. But oftentimes, where the righteous exist, the wicked are also blessed. That's just the way it goes. And that is what was happening here. But it was because Abraham was in the way. He preserved and upheld the truth, and he had life. Genesis 23, 1 through 4. And Sarah was 107 and 20 years old, and these were the years of the life of Sarah. And Sarah died in Kirjatharaba, the same is Hebron, in the land of Canaan. And Abraham came to mourn for Sarah and to weep for her. And Abraham stood up from before his dead and spake unto the sons of Heth, saying, I am a stranger. All of this land was promised to Abraham by God for his descendants. But here is Abraham in a foreign land. It's the promised land for him, but he's in a foreign land. I am a stranger and a sojourner with you. Give me a possession of a burying place with you, that I might bury my dead out of my sight. And I just think that's so amazing, because this is Abraham's land. But yet Abraham didn't consider it his, because it wasn't his yet, the physical sense of it. And so he asks for a plot, a burial plot for his wife. And of course, Abraham lived on beyond his wife a few years. Genesis 25, 7 through 8. And these are the days of the years of Abraham's life, which he lived 150 years. Then Abraham gave up the ghost and died in a good old age, an old man full of years, and was gathered to his people. 175 years old. Did he get the promised land? Nope. He did not achieve the promised land. And that, to me, is what this perseverance is all about. Endurance to the end. Abraham endured to the end. Yeah, he made some mistakes, and we didn't read all of them. He had some errors, some wrong decisions, but God continued to bless him because Abraham corrected his mistakes and moved on in the right direction. And that's what this is all about. It's staying the course. Yes, an athlete, when he's preparing, he may pull a muscle, he may trip and fall, he may, who knows what, break a leg, but he gets up, he fixes the problem, and he continues to pursue his goal. And that's what we have to be, just like Abraham. 175 years of enduring to the end. And then after him, Isaac, Genesis 35, 28 through 29. And the days of Isaac were 180 years, and Isaac gave up the ghost and died, and was gathered unto his people, being old and full of days. And his son Esau and Jacob buried him. Did Isaac get the promised land? Nope. So we've got 175 with Abraham, 205 with Terah before Abraham, 180 now with Isaac. And do they have the promise? They don't. But they continue to endure because the promise is there, and God always fulfills his promise. But if we were looking through purely the eyes of humans, any one of them could have said, obviously this prophecy, this promise is false, and God is false. And so often that's what we do. When things don't happen just like we think they're supposed to happen, we call God out and we say, you must be false. No, we've got to continue to endure to the end. Things will happen when God says they will happen. We go on to Jacob, Genesis 47, 28 through 30. And Jacob lived in the land of Egypt 17 years. So the whole age of Jacob was 147 years. And the time drew nigh that Israel must die. And he called his son Joseph, and said unto him, If now I have found grace in thy sight, put, I pray thee, thy hand under my thigh, and deal kindly and truly with me. Bury me not, I pray thee, in Egypt, but I will lie with my fathers, and thou shalt carry me out of Egypt, and bury me in their burying place. And he said, I will do as thou hast said. 147 years. Terah, 205. Abraham, 175. Isaac, 180. Jacob, 147. Have they achieved the promised land yet? Nope. It's still a promise for the future. And sometimes that's the way we live. We live with a promise for a life in God's kingdom, but we need to hold the course throughout our entire life, continually striving for that promised land and everything that promised land means. So what is perseverance? What do we preserve in? We preserve in true mercy. We preserve in being authentic, who we are. We preserve in being peacemakers. We preserve in having true love. We preserve in having long suffering. We preserve in the true faith. We preserve in understanding and discerning spirits, and in many other things. Meekness, mercy, humbleness, charity, all of those things. We preserve, we continue, we stay the course. No matter what the world tries to do, no matter how it tries to take us off course, we, to get the gold prize, have to endure. We have to stay the course. We have to keep fighting for a better thing. How can we hope for a better tomorrow? Like Abraham, we can live our best today, learning from our mistakes, every day becoming better people. That's who we have to be. Every day becoming better people, striving that much more to be the people we need to be in perfection. That's how we hope for a better tomorrow. How do we become pillars in the temple of God? We become pillars by being firm. And this is important. One of the next studies we're going to get into, we're going to talk about these pillars, because we don't just need to be pillars. We need to be pillars that can withstand earthquakes. If you've been following these studies from well back into previous studies, sometime back, you can actually go through the YouTube channel and find the one called The End of the Era. And you will find there's some dreams. We go into Revelations a little bit. One of the important things in that study is there is a great earthquake. Okay? That great earthquake is talking not about a physical earthquake. However, there may be many physical earthquakes, but it specifically is talking about something that is shaking all the nations. And this is important because a building, when it is shaken by an earthquake, falls. But we need to be solid temples in God's temple. We need to be earthquake proof as much as we can be. And that is what we need to be thinking about today. We need to be focusing all of our energies on becoming these pillars, holding the truth diligently, holding the way diligently, living the real life of Jesus Christ, being these firm temples no matter how the world shakes, no matter what happens. If economies crumble, if nations crumble, none of that matters. We hold the course. We are not of some particular people, ethnicity, or race, or nation. We are God's children, first and foremost. We must stay the course. Thank you for this time. I hope the study blesses you, and I hope it gives you some new thoughts, because we do have a course to stay, and we do have a nation to build, the spiritual Israel, the Israel that God has given to us. We have an inheritance, and we must stay the course. God bless, and have a wonderful day.